So you wanted the inside scoop on India's maintenance laws, right? Well, buckle up, because we're about to go deep on this one.
Yeah, it gets pretty interesting.
You know, with all the buzz lately, we just had to take a closer look. And let me tell you, this deep dive took us all the way to the Supreme Court, a 2020 case, Rajnesh v. Neha. Talk about a wild ride.
And what really makes India's laws unique is, well, there isn't just one law on maintenance.
Wait, really?
Yeah, multiple laws are all tangled up together.
Okay, so, like, what kind of laws are we talking about here?
Let's see. We dug into the Special Marriage Act, the Hindu Marriage Act, the Hindu Adoptions and Maintenance Act.
Okay, keeping up.
Oh, and don't forget parts of the Criminal Procedure Code and even the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act. It's a lot.
Whoa, that's a whole lot of laws. So could someone actually, like, use more than one of these laws at the same time?
Absolutely. Think about it. A Hindu wife could potentially file for maintenance under, like, several of these laws all at once.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay, but going back to that Rajnesh v. Neha case.
Yeah.
7 years just to decide on interim maintenance.
Yeah, it's a classic example of how messy these cases can get, how long they drag on.
I mean, that's just unbelievable.
It is. So basically, you had a wife who left the marital home, and she asked for maintenance for herself and her son. The husband fought it, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court.
7 years. And you know what gets me? The husband admitted he owed some back payments, but still didn't pay. What's the point of even having court orders if people just ignore them?
Right. It raises a big question about how effective these laws really are if they can't be enforced. But what's interesting is the Supreme Court really used Rajnesh v. Neha to try to, well, bring some order to the whole system.
So they were like, enough is enough.
Pretty much. They basically said, hey, these things need to be resolved faster. 7 years is just crazy, right? And they really focused on that whole problem of enforcement. They actually reached out to legal services folks all over India to get their perspective, on the ground level.
Like they wanted to see how things were really working.
Exactly. And one of the biggest things to come out of this was a new rule. Both sides in a case now have to submit what's called an affidavit of disclosure of assets and liabilities.
Sounds serious.
It is. Basically, it's all about transparency. You have to lay out all your finances, income, assets, debts, everything.
No more hiding stuff.
Nope. The goal is to make setting the maintenance amount more objective, more fair.
Makes sense. But India is a huge, diverse country. Did they, account for that in this affidavit thing?
Oh, absolutely. They actually made different formats for the affidavit. One for urban areas, one for rural areas.
Okay.
And even one specifically for tribal areas. They recognized that Meghalaya, with its unique matrilineal society, needed something different.
Wow, that's some serious attention to detail.
Yeah.
So this affidavit sounds like a big step, but when do the payments actually start? I mean, waiting 7 years, like in that case, that's just brutal.
I know. And before Rajnesh v. Neha, it was all over the place. Some courts would say payments start from the date the maintenance is granted, others from the application date. It was a mess.
So someone could be struggling financially while they wait for a decision.
Exactly. The Supreme Court put an end to that, though. They said from now on, maintenance has to be awarded from the date the application is filed.
So no more dragging things out and causing unnecessary hardship. That's good. But let's be real. What happens if someone just flat out refuses to pay? A court order's only good if it's actually enforced, right?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's a huge challenge in these cases. You've got tools like the Civil Procedure Code, the Criminal Procedure Code, even the DV Act. But they don't always get the job done.
Why not? What makes it so hard to enforce?
Sometimes it's real financial hardship, but sometimes it's just a way to avoid responsibility. And then there's this tactic some courts use called striking off defense. It's pretty controversial.
Striking off what?
Defense. It basically means the court says, look, you're not paying what you were ordered to pay. Fine. But we're also not going to let you argue your side in the divorce case until you do.
Oh, wow. So it's like no pay, no say?
Pretty much. It definitely gets people's attention.
I bet it does.
Huh?
But is it actually effective? And is it even fair?
Well, that's where opinions get divided. Some people say it's the only way to hold people accountable. Others think it's too harsh, that it denies someone's right to a fair hearing.
So it's a tough call trying to figure out what's fair and what actually works. What else did we learn about this striking off defense thing from our research?
Well, it's not something that's done the same way everywhere in India. Different courts have different approaches, and there's a lot of debate about whether it's even legal. It's definitely something that's evolving.
Okay, so to recap, we've got this whole web of laws, a landmark case trying to bring some order, the new affidavit rule, and this constant struggle to get people to actually pay up.
And that's just scratching the surface.
Wow. So much to unpack here. Stay tuned, because we're diving even deeper into the world of Indian maintenance laws right after the break. Welcome back. So we were just talking about how tough it can be to enforce those maintenance orders in India. It's a real challenge, right?
Yeah, it is. You want to protect the person who needs the financial support, but you also don't want to create a system that people can just manipulate. And that striking off defense thing we were talking about, well, turns out not everyone's a fan.
Oh, really? So some courts are saying no way to no pay, no say.
Pretty much. Like Punjab and Haryana High Court, they actually reversed a lower court's decision to strike off a husband's defense just because he wasn't paying interim maintenance. It was the Gurvinder Singh v. Murthy and Orrs case.
Interesting. What was their reasoning? Why were they against it?
Well, they basically said, look, we already have ways to enforce these orders, especially in the criminal procedure code. They felt that striking off the defense was going around those rules.
So sticking to the existing tools instead of jumping to something more extreme.
Right. They also felt it wouldn't really speed things up. Actually getting the person their money might even make the whole fight drag on longer.
That's a good point. If you don't let someone defend themselves, it probably just makes things messier and more complicated, right?
Exactly. And that's a big criticism of this whole striking off defense thing. It disrupts the normal legal process and can lead to more appeals, more delays, defeats the whole purpose, really.
Okay, so it's not a perfect solution. Were there other courts that had issues with this tactic?
Oh, yeah. The Madhya Pradesh High Court. They had something to say about it, too. In Venkateshwar Dwivedi v. Ruchi Dwivedi, they basically said that neither the Criminal Procedure Code nor the Family Courts Act actually gives courts the power to do that, to strike off defenses.
So they were questioning whether courts even have the authority to do that in the first place. Did they suggest any other ways to handle it?
They were big on using the methods that are already in the law, like attaching property or even civil detention, actually making people pay up.
It sounds like they were saying, follow the rules, don't take shortcuts. Do they give any specifics on how those existing tools should be used?
This judgment was actually really important because it made it clear that a maintenance order can be enforced just like any other civil court order for money.
Meaning
you can use all the tools under the Civil Procedure Code to get that money.
So things like seizing assets, even jail time if someone just keeps refusing to pay.
Exactly. They basically said those options are on the table and courts shouldn't hesitate to use them when it's clear the person is, deliberately trying to get out of paying.
So it's about sending a message. These orders are serious and there are real consequences for ignoring them. But I'm still a bit confused about striking off defense. If some courts are saying it's not allowed, how is it still happening in some cases?
Well, even the Supreme Court has upheld it in certain situations. Like in the Kaushaliya v. Mukesh Jain case, a family court had struck off the respondent's defense because they kept failing to pay even after a court order, and the Supreme Court was okay with that.
So even the highest court sees it as a valid option sometimes.
Yeah. Even those courts that have used it generally agree that it should be a last resort for really extreme cases.
What makes a case extreme, though? What kind of behavior would justify that kind of response?
Usually it's when the non-payment is clearly intentional, like a total disregard for the court's authority. And of course, it has to be causing real hardship for the person who's depending on that money.
So not just someone who's genuinely struggling, but someone who's trying to use it as a weapon, as leverage in the divorce.
Right. It's about intent. And courts are really sensitive to this being used against, say, a stay-at-home spouse who doesn't have their own income.
It makes sense that they'd want to protect people who are especially vulnerable in those situations. This striking off defense area is still pretty murky, though. Mm-hmm. Where's the line between using it appropriately and overstepping?
It's a gray area, for sure. And it'll probably keep being debated. But the important thing is, courts are aware of the potential for misuse. It's not something they do lightly.
So they're trying to strike that balance. Having the power to enforce these orders, but not going too far and denying someone their right to have a say in their own case.
That's a great way to put it. And Rajnesh v. Neha, it's really helped clarify things.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how one case can have such a big impact. Forces courts to really look at these tough issues and figure out how to make things work better. But let's switch gears a bit. We've talked about the laws, the Rajnesh case, the affidavit, how hard enforcement can be. What else did we learn from our deep dive into the materials?
Well, there's the whole question of how the amount of maintenance is actually decided. There's no magic formula, and courts look at a ton of things to figure out what's fair.
Okay, let's break that down. What are some of the things that judges consider when they're trying to figure out, how much someone should pay or receive?
Well, first off, it's important to remember that maintenance isn't about punishing the person who's paying. It's about making sure the person receiving it can actually maintain a decent standard of living.
So it's not about, getting revenge. It's about providing support. But how do they define a decent standard? What factors contribute to that?
One of the first things they look at is the status of both parties, like their social standing, the lifestyle they had during the marriage.
So if someone was used to a certain level of, comfort and financial security during the marriage, the court tries to make sure they can continue living that way.
Yeah. The goal is to prevent a drastic change in their lifestyle. But of course, they also have to consider the other spouse's financial situation, right? You can't get blood from a stone, as they say.
That's true. You can't force someone to pay more than they can afford.
Right.
But how do they decide what's affordable?
They look at the paying spouse's income, assets, debts, even how many other dependents they have to support.
It's a whole picture of their financial situation. What about the person receiving the maintenance? Do their earnings or assets matter?
Absolutely. They consider their income, their ability to earn a living, and any assets they have. It's about figuring out their real need for support.
So if they have a good job or a lot of assets, they might get less maintenance. Or maybe nothing at all.
Exactly. It's about being fair and making sure no one's getting more than they need.
Okay, that makes sense. What about things like age and work history? Do those play a role?
Definitely. Especially if one spouse put their career on hold to take care of the family.
Like a stay-at-home parent.
Right. Courts recognize that getting back into the workforce after a long break can be really hard, especially as you get older.
So they might award more maintenance or extend it for longer to help that person get back on their feet.
That's right.
What if someone has a serious illness or disability? Does that affect things?
For sure. They consider the cost of medical care, ongoing treatment, any special support that might be needed.
So the maintenance might be adjusted to cover those costs.
Definitely.
So it's clear that figuring out the maintenance amount isn't just about pulling out a calculator. It's about real people's lives.
It is. And that's why cases like Rajnesh v. Neha are so important.
What kind of guidance did that case give on calculating maintenance?
Well, one big thing was emphasizing the right to residence.
Oh, right. We talked about that earlier with the Domestic Violence Act and the idea of a shared household. How does that tie into maintenance?
It's pretty simple, really. If one spouse gets to stay in the family home without paying rent, that frees up a lot of money they would have had to spend on housing.
So the court would factor that in when deciding how much maintenance is needed.
Exactly. Rajnesh v. Neha really highlighted how important housing costs are.
Okay, that makes sense. This whole conversation has been really eye-opening. It's clear that maintenance in India isn't just a simple transaction. It's about finding that balance, looking at all these different factors, and making sure things are fair for everyone involved.
It is. And it's important to remember that these cases can be really emotionally charged.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's easy to get caught up in the emotions of it all.
Right. That's why it's so important to have legal guidance, to really understand your rights and options.
So you can make informed decisions, not just emotional ones.
Exactly. Knowledge is power.
Okay, let's do a quick review of what we've covered. We talked about the different laws governing maintenance, how they sometimes overlap, the importance of the Rajnesh case in setting some guidelines, the challenges of actually enforcing these orders, and all those different factors that come into play when deciding on the amount of maintenance.
Yeah, we've covered a lot.
And we're not done yet. We have even more to discuss, so stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll wrap things up and leave you with some food for thought. And we're back for the final part of our deep dives into Indian maintenance laws. Wow, we've really gone deep, haven't we? From Rajnesh v. Neha to all the challenges of making sure those payments actually happen and figuring out just how much those payments should be.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. As we wrap up, I thought it might be helpful to, highlight a few key things that really stood out to me from all the research we did.
Absolutely. What were some of your big takeaways?
Well, the fact that India has so many laws dealing with maintenance, it's not just like a coincidence. It actually reflects a deep-rooted value in Indian society, this idea of taking care of family members even when relationships end.
So it's not just about the legal stuff. It's a cultural thing, this commitment to making sure people are supported. That's really interesting.
It is. It's woven into the very fabric of Indian law. Like, look at the Hindu Adoptions and Maintenance Act, or the Criminal Procedure Code, even the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act. They all stress this duty to provide financial support.
Right. It's like a safety net, especially for people who might be financially dependent on their spouse. What else really stood out to you?
You know, the Supreme Court's approach in Rajnesh v. Neha, that was really important. I mean, they pushed for a faster process, more transparency with that affidavit. They made it clear when those payments should start. All big steps towards a fairer, more efficient system.
They weren't just focused on that one case. They were trying to fix the whole system, right?
Exactly. And one thing that really struck me was how they went out and got input from all those legal services people across India. Shows they really wanted to understand how these laws were playing out in real life, you know?
It's like they were saying, we need to hear from the people who are actually dealing with this, not just the lawyers and judges.
Right. India is a diverse country. Different social norms, different economic realities. You can't just have a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think that's why they created those different affidavit formats, you know, for urban areas, rural areas, tribal areas.
It shows they were really thinking about how to make this work for everyone.
Okay, so big picture. What's the most important thing for people to understand about maintenance laws in India? What's the key takeaway?
For me, it's this. These laws exist for a reason. They reflect this societal value, this commitment to protecting vulnerable people and ensuring everyone can live with dignity, even after a relationship ends.
It's not just about legalities. It's about social justice, right? Making sure everyone has what they need to move forward. Exactly. And yeah, the system's not perfect. Enforcement is always a challenge and things can get complicated, but the framework is there and it's constantly evolving to better serve people's needs.
It's encouraging to see the law being used like that, as a force for good, a way to make sure people are treated fairly. Okay, last question. What really stands out to you as the most important thing we learned?
You know, what really got me thinking was how the courts are always trying to find this balance, making sure people get the support they deserve, but also preventing abuse of the system.
It's a tough job, isn't it? Trying to do what's right without creating loopholes for people to exploit. So how do we find that balance? What's the key?
I think it's about having clear guidelines, strong enforcement, and a willingness to adapt, you know, as things change. Rajnesh v. Neha was a big step, and I think we'll keep seeing the laws evolve as courts grapple with these issues.
So it's an ongoing process, making the system work better for everyone. Well, this deep dive has been incredibly interesting. I think we both learned a lot today. But before we go, I want to leave our listener with something to think about, you know, something that wasn't directly addressed in our research. This whole case really highlighted this tension between supporting people who need help and making sure the system isn't taken advantage of. Where do we draw that line? How do we make sure things are both compassionate and accountable? It's something to think about as we navigate these complex relationships, both personal and legal.
That's a great question and a really important one. It's something we'll probably be debating for a long time.
That's the beauty of it, right? The law reflects our values, how we think about justice and fairness, and how we want society to work. It's always evolving.
It is.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. We hope you found it as fascinating as we did. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing and stay curious.